So today we are talking about the Exodus. We're not talking about the Exodus. We're talking about the Passover Seder. And I remember when I was growing up, I don't know if anybody who grew up in America, if you went to the model Seder, anybody do that? It's like you want to like off yourself during it, you know, because it's so boring. All my memories from Jewish education when I was young were just horrible. The model Seder was like really a form of torture, right? So I'm trying to revisit and reclaim my heritage here, and that's part of it. And going over it, some of us together have been reading rabbinic sources. And one of the things that we found in reading rabbinic sources is that if you treat them like made things, if you treat them like poetry and you attribute to them the same complexity of intention that you would to Donne or Shakespeare or Milton, you will find that their made things tolerate that kind of complexity. And I think, unfortunately, Jewish education on so many different levels emphasizes the story that I guess educators think we're going to like, which is the cartoon one. And for me, going back to the Haggadah is like, I mean, it's weird also because I think the Haggadah is an incredibly overread book, meaning not overread, but it's a book with so much commentary on it. I mean, have anybody had a fresh encounter with the Haggadah outside of like your memories of Passover at your Uncle Morty's or the commentaries that you've read on it or the little Haggadahs that you had when you were sitting at the table? To me, the Haggadah is just like it's already so saturated with meaning. So I wanted to come back to the text and really just think about the text as a text. I mean, I think maybe a little bit of what I'm saying is part of what the Haggadah is, that it's a text already told many, 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 many times. And the beginning of, and the Haggadah itself is accommodating that. Meaning it understands that this story is not being told for the first time. I try to explore that a little bit more. So do people know, I know Shimon is here and I know he'll know the answer to this, but what is the structure of the Haggadah? How is it structured in literary terms? Are literary terms relevant to talking about the Haggadah? So the Talmud talks about a dispute between two of the Amoraim, Rav and Shmuel, and they argue about, well, they agree on one thing. They say that the Haggadah should start from Ganut, right? From Gnus, from disgrace, and it should lead to Shevach. Right? Am I getting that right? Starts with disgrace and ends with praise. And then, so you see that they're imagining the Haggadah in narrative terms, meaning it has a beginning and a middle, obviously, and an end. The beginning for both, the end is not specified, I don't think, but the beginning is different for both of them. One of them says, when you recount the disgrace of the Jewish people and you see the extent to which they went from this state of disgrace to something ennobled, Rav said that, well, they started as idol worshippers, right? What's the part in the Haggadah that says that? I always get them confused. So, and Shmuel, the one who argues with Rav all the time, says it doesn't begin there. The disgrace of the Jewish people begins with the fact that our forefathers were idol worshippers. I mean, the content is interesting. The frame is very different, right? What is the frame through which you're going to tell the story? What is the beginning of the story? Is the beginning of the story, I mean, which would you say? If you were gonna, you know, you're building your Haggadah from Rav and Shmuel, what would you say? Which would you start with? Again, Rav is idol worshiper slavery. And really asking this from literary terms, what's the better story? What's the most impactful story?
From slavery to freedom.
It seems like, I was wondering, slavery to freedom seems like the obvious one, right? Especially if it's the Haggadah, why would you think otherwise? right? So you have to figure out what Rav what he was thinking, because Shmuel seems so obvious, right? That's the story. So start at the beginning of the story we're telling. So you have to figure out what Rav was saying, because Rav was no fool, right? So he says again that it's the beginning. What do people remember the Haggadah? It's like in the beginning. Which one do we start with actually? Let's see. Which do we start with? Well, we actually don't start with. Here we are. So Avadim Hayinu, right? So who do we? Mitzrayim. So we start with Rav or Shmuel. We start with Shmuel. We start with what makes the most sense. Strangely, right? I mean, not strangely. You'll see that there is something a little bit strange about it. And later on, Shmuel, Rav's position is accommodated. Here it is. Mitchila of the Avodah Zarah Avotenu, right? Weird. Let's. I mean, does anybody have a sense of what Rav, what the idol worship shot would be, or do we have to look more at the Haggadah? I think it might make sense to look a little bit more.
Well,
so,
it's starting with starting with spiritual rather than material poverty.
Okay. Right. Okay. It starts with the spiritual, and it's also, but also, what is the advantage of having the long haul here? Meaning, what do I get by adding the patriarchs and the matriarchs? I mean, it's just encompassing more.
You
Yes,
get some
Vivian.
Common
background.
ancestry.
You get some kind of background to the story,
Right.
setting,
And the patriarchs,
what happened first.
right. Okay, we have to get to that also. And the patriarchs are really crucial to the story that we're reading about, even though they're not present, right? Sorry, Vivian?
Right, because we are descendants from them, so that's how everybody can feel included. Otherwise, it's just the story of somebody else or what happened to somebody else.
Right. I mean, there's also something else, and we'll talk a little bit about the way time and narrative is represented in the Haggadah. The story of the Exodus from Egypt, the patriarchs knew about that, right? That's the whole Brit Bein HaBetarim with Abraham. They knew about that. Now, the sages, the rabbis say that the patriarchs only knew God by his name Elohim, and did not know God as Tetragrammaton, Yud Ke Vav Ke. They didn't know that. And the difference is that the patriarchs did not know the God who fulfills promises. Moses does. It's very, very interesting, right? Because the patriarchs and matriarchs live in a kind of temporality which changes with Moses. And I think the Haggadah is, so on some level, the Haggadah really is about that story that has been told, that was predicted and has been fulfilled. And that's to me, and just as a sidebar to some people who've studied Greek things with me, to me, that seems kind of Greek, where you already know the beginning and the end. You already see, I mean, it's like Odysseus's destiny. He has a destiny from the beginning because we know his end. The Greek world, people are predetermined, and we're reading about a story. We already know the beginning, and we already know the end. So that one of the questions we would ask also is, to what extent is that the only temporal frame available in the Haggadah? Is there another temporal frame there? And we know that the Haggadah not only deals with the Geula from Mitzrayim, it also, and it's not always very explicit, but it also anticipates a future Geula. And that's a different temporal frame. Right, there's the temporal frame of the patriarchs, and they don't know about the fulfillment of the story. We read about that fulfilled story. The Geula that comes is a different conception of time. And that notion of time is only given to Moses. First of all, he knows about the past promise fulfilled, but then there is also the hope for a future. There's a movement towards a future. It's very strange, actually, and this is true in the Christian tradition as well, that we know what the end is, but we can't get there. Right? We can't. The problem with fundamentalists, political parties, and theologians is they think that they can embody what that thing is at the end in history. And once you do that in history, you're basically an idolater, right? Because you're idolizing a particular perspective which is not available. It's not available. That's why theocracies are dangerous. That was my election comment for the day. So let's keep in mind those different temporal frames. Just at the beginning of the Seder, there is this opening, halachmania. This is the bread of our destitution. Here, let's read it in English. This is the bread of destitution that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. This is Aramaic. To know what we have to ask that later. Anyone who is famished should come and eat. Anyone who is in need should come and partake of the Korban Pesach. Yes, Pesach sacrifice. Now we're here. Next year we will be in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year we'll be free people. And you can really see in this passage here what I was just talking about, because temporally it's very uncertain. This is right. The bread of destitution. Everybody should come and partake of the sacrifices, celebrating our freedom. And yet, now we are here. Next year we'll be in the land of Israel. The land of Israel is not only a spatial designation, it's also a temporal one, meaning messianic age. We don't live in that. Thank God we're in Israel. It's not an academic program. Thank God we're in Israel, but that's not that we have not. Look around us. These are not messianic times, right? This year we are slaves. Next year we will be free people. It's like a very strange way of opening it up. Right? The story opens up, which is ostensibly, which we know it's the celebration of the Exodus, but still there is this continued sense of bitterness. Right? We know there are three parts of the Seder, the most important parts, three things: Pesach, Matzah, Moror. You have to talk about all those three things. The third thing is Moror, is bitterness, which we're eating now. It does say, I guess, we're commemorating the suffering that we lived through, but there still is implicit here that sense of not total redemption, which again goes to those two temporal frames I was talking about. I'm going to go a little fast just for a bit, and I just want to talk about the continued structure of the Seder. What's the deal with the four questions? Why is that prominent in the Seder? What does the Baal Haggadah put it there? All for the kids, right? The Haggadah is the pedagogical holiday. It really is. I said it was dinner theater. It's the pedagogical holiday. It is the moment of it is the enactment of Jewish tradition, which is a very, very cool thing. I think Stephen Greenblatt, who's a Jewish guy, who's a very great literary critic, does not know a lot about Judaism, but I think he said that the matzah is like it's the Judaism's Eucharistic moment, and it just for so many reasons is so wrong, because the holiness in the Haggadah is in the telling of the story. It has nothing to do with the holiness of a thing. We don't believe that, right? It's in the telling of the story and the means through which that story gets told.
I wanted to say that I think it's also a reaffirmation of the relationship between child and parent. That the child, the child has to ask, anyone who's brought up 2-year-old, 3-year-old and been driven mad by why? But it's part of the whole nature of the child, the curiosity, and the parent as the guide, the leader.
Right, very good. Right, we'll come back to that in a bit also. Some of the things that you mentioned, but lechem aniyah, the sages said, the rabbis say that it's because it's the lechem of poor people, but lechem onim, the lechem over which we answer questions, which is a little bit we're getting what Fran was saying. And again, what I'm saying in relation to Greenblatt, for us, for the Haggadah, this is a discursive holiday. it's a holiday about telling. It's a holiday very much about teaching. There are 4 questions. I think they break down to what we eat and how we eat it, right? We eat matzah and we don't eat chametz, we only eat matzah. We eat all kinds of vegetables during the rest of the year. Now we're only eating more. On the other, and this is the how part, on the other nights, we dip only once, and now we're dipping twice. On other days, we can decide to recline or not recline. Now we only recline. So there are 4 questions here. And as we'll see, and maybe let's go there right now. I mean, it's just, let's not go there right now. I wanted to show you a little bit of what's odd about the Haggadah, and without going very carefully into the text. Oh, but here the next part is Magid, is the answer, is the beginning of answering the question. Okay, so Avadim hayinu l'paro b'Mitzrayim, and God took us out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And if the Holy One, blessed be He, had not taken our ancestors out of Egypt, we would still be slaves. Our children would be slaves. The children would be slaves. How is that possibly true? That's hi, Alana. Long time no see. How is that possibly true? When I was growing up, this always bothered me. And
Because until the Messiah comes, we're slaves.
yeah, that's much too religious for me. No.
No, that's right.
I mean, maybe. I mean, I shouldn't reject what you said so quickly, Rodney. I hear what you're saying. I mean, I would. Yeah, go ahead.
Moshe, like you said, when Moshe was, when he got the Torah, and he got the Torah Shebel Peh, so he got everything.
Okay.
So that's what I learned. That he got everything.
Whatever that means. You have to qualify that with comma, whatever that means.
Right, but
if you don't qualify that with comma, whatever that means, then you become
no. But he got the Parshanuyot, and he got the.
Okay.
Again, this is not my reading. This is what I've been told.
So now it's me against your junior high school Sunday school teacher?
No, actually, the university professor who taught me.
Okay, even worse.
Last semester.
I'm sorry to hear that. Okay, whatever. It makes no sense.
Really?
To say that he got, what does it mean he got? So he got it, he got it all, meaning what? There are 2,000 years of tradition of Torah Shebel Peh. He got all of that?
Yes.
It was deposited in his brain?
He got everything, and then according to the professor that taught me this,
I'm in trouble now as a Jewish studies professor. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it was Jewish. Yeah, and then we are meant to discuss it for the next years, but everything was already given.
Right. I would suggest
nothing new.
I would suggest something, learning it a little bit differently, and it's not completely irrelevant to what we're talking about now. That Moshe Rabbeinu, that whatever he received already had contained within it the possibilities of all the interpretations that were going to come afterwards. And the written tradition is not predetermined. And that's the weird thing about the Jewish tradition. There are many, many midrashim that deal with this problem. How is it possible that Moshe could have known everything and yet still allowed for the freedom of people? And the midrashim do deal with that. But there certainly is a sense, and also in the Haggadah as well, that we are interested in the way in which stories get embodied in history in this world. That's what's happening in the Haggadah, right? It's the embodiment of the story, the telling of the story. I always say, I never say this because I don't want people to think I'm a heretic, but I don't care what happened. It doesn't matter what happened. I mean, something happened, and then people started to tell stories about it. And the storytelling is the only way that the holy is accessible, through that storytelling. So I would suggest also, the reason the Haggadah is saying this, and it does make sense, is without the choosing of the Jewish people and the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, there would be no conception of freedom. We would not have a conception of freedom. I mean, you look at me all so stunned. Where would it come from? Where freedom is just something out there that we can go pick off a tree? It just makes sense. It's the intuitive default. The intuitive default is slaughter. The intuitive default is people killing each other, right? And freedom is I know what I'm saying is controversial, and I know about the Greeks as well, but to me, and I think there is a sense in which also liberalism is based upon the idea of relationship, of freedom through relationship that comes here at Har Sinai. And the inheritance of Har Sinai is not just the Torah, it is the idea of a relationship to the sacred. And that has been taken up by Christians, Muslims, and liberals, Hamilton, right? Locke. So to me, that's how I understand it. And then it goes on, and we were talking before about the questions, and I want to go back to that. Afilu kulana chachamim, kulana navonim, kulana zakenim, kulana yodim et Torah mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'yetziat Mitzrayim. We should all be so happy, right? Where this is somebody, the Haggadah is telling us, telling stories is good. The more you tell stories, the better, right? What do the STEM researchers at Bar Ilan say now, right? So the 4 questions then, and you were right before, Fran, to emphasize this relationship to children. And so much of the Haggadah, and if you also look in the way the halacha is brought down, the halacha is brought down, all of the arguments about what in practice we do are centered on keeping the attention of the children. That they should ask, right? You want them to ask, manishtana. Well, how is this night different? To me, it's strange. This is the case, but also, and this I wanted you to in on this one. The 4 questions are asked about things the kids haven't seen yet, right? We did drink the wine and lean. We didn't eat the maror. We didn't eat the matzah. So, and we know, right, the whole Haggadah structured by that story, but also questions and answers. I'll ask you one more detail. Can you hold on to that question? That question's for you, okay? Hold on to that question, right? Then we get it's praiseworthy to tell the story, and then we have an example, right? The Masa bar Rabbi Eliezer and the story of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shua, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Kiva, and Rabbi Tarver, and they're reclining in Bnei Brak, and we're telling the story of the Exodus for that whole night. Kolato alayla ad shabbat talmideim v'amru lehem rabbeinu hagias man kriyas shema shel shachri. So what do these guys end up doing? They're doing the mitzvah, right? It seems that they're doing the mitzvah, that they're celebrating it, that they're telling the story all night. Now, this story gets problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, we only tell the story. You have to eat the afikomen, al pi halacha, by midnight. So what are they doing all night, right? Some commentaries go so far as to say this was not Passover night, the Sfat Emet, but it does say they were kol oto halayla, right? Kol oto halayla, what does that mean? So it's got to be the Leil Seder. It has to be the night of the Seder. But still it raises questions. And then their Talmidim come and say, now it's time to say Kriyat Shema. So one thing we learn from the story is the extent to which, the way in which we see this manifested. Even if we know everything, there still is the value in the discussion, in the conversation. Even if you're alone, you ask yourself the question. Question and answer. And what do? The Talmidim come and say, it's time to say Shema, which is also a kind of weird way this story continues. Because there is an obligation from the Torah to say the Shema every morning, but that's an independent obligation. There's the chiyuv of telling the story, Sipur Yitzit Mitzrayim, and then there's the chiyuv twice daily of saying the Shema. So they go from this special night of Pesach, of telling the story, and then when they wake up, it's interesting really, when they wake up, the drama that they experienced in telling the story, Ba'ato Alayla, gets embodied in the everyday. We go from this moment, that special mitzvah of Leil Seder, to the daily routine of saying the Shema. So the storytelling then leads to a daily practice. So then there's a discussion, we'll skip over this, about when to say the Shema. Do you say the Shema, there's a machloket, there's a dispute. Do you say the Shema morning and night? There's the word kol yemei chayecha, all the days of your life. Or do you say, and that's what Rav Eliezer says, he learns this. The sages say all the days of your life means this world. Oh, sorry, the days of your life means this world. Here's on the bottom. All the days of your life indicates the remembrance in the days of the Messiah. So according to the sages, interestingly, you don't have to say the Shema at night. But in Olam Haba, when we're all getting together for our Zoom lectures, we will still be celebrating Passover. That's a weird concept, isn't it? What is conveyed by that? I mean, why would the rabbis say that? Why would they say this? What does it mean to be able to say, I'm going to tell a story when I'm dead? I mean,
Are you able to do work at the same time, Mom?
Pardon? That's your
Sorry.
household? It's not your husband is chipping in?
Yeah, he's cleaning and he's asking me if I can join him while listening.
Why don't you have him join us while we're talking? You can take a break from cleaning. Alana, you're a tough taskmaster, huh?
Yeah, I guess so.
So, does anybody want to relate to the bizarreness of this telling of a story in the afterlife?
Maybe it's people after we've gone, the people that we've told, they carry on telling the story, and so on and so on. It's the I think it's a collective memory. So I see it.
So the collective memory, the eternality of this thing. I think in a way, one way of understanding tradition, and the Seder is the embodiment or the enactment of tradition. And in the enacting of tradition, you have that moment through which the eternal gets expressed. It's kind of what Fran is saying. And that moment through which the eternal gets expressed is in the relationship between parent and child, right? That moment between parent and child, because it is in a way, it's not only universal among people, it's temporally universal. In that moment of the handing over of the sacred story to the child, that's where tradition dwells. And the eternal makes itself present in that moment. So maybe, Fran, as you're saying, that's part of what's being suggested here. I think it is tradition has a bad name because it's practiced so poorly, because tradition turns into replication. It's very hard. We humans like to be part of mass movements and replication. A lot of people unfortunately do. But there is the opportunity, and that's what Pesach is about, is to be free. And to be free means to tell it your way, right? To relate to the eternal, but to tell it your way to your kids. Right? So this is all, it's basically, the Seder is all about parenting in a way, right? Then we get into the 4 sons, right? Look what the Haggadah has done so far. There's the mitzvah of telling it. First, we didn't also point out that the story gets interrupted here. We have the beginning according to Shmuel, but we stop then. Then we get the story of people who did say it. Then we get the story. Then we get a story about when to say it. Now we get about who are the people to whom we're saying it, right? It's like covering all the angles. What comes next? Then when do we say it, right? Yachol mirosh chodesh. Again, and this is, meaning we could have said it from the beginning of Nisan. Why don't we? That was a miraculous month. This is also to incorporate into the question I'm asking you, Ed, right? Why are we getting guidelines for something we're doing already? We're doing this, right? Why are you telling me this? But so it does go through all of these things. I mean, the four sons or the 4 children, in some way, is the most interesting part, because it really does emphasize pedagogy. When you were growing up, which son were you asked to read? No, you can have fun with that. We have a son with Down syndrome, so he gets the wise son, right? Just saying, the smarty pants gets, the Tom. Yeah, and so these are also who do you like best of all of the 4 sons? Who's your favorite of the 4 sons? Come on, Alana, let's hear it.
No, you know that I always identify with the wicked, the rebellious, and the wicked. And when I was a kid in Purim and we used to put Purim plays on in my family, I was Haman, of course.
Okay. Are you available? You're available for Purim Sudot. So we'll let you.
So I'm always associated with the wicked and the rebellious.
Right. So I think, the different ways in which the 4 sons are combined in pairs, as opposites, as similars, as similarities in different commentaries, there is so many variations of it that the preponderance of commentaries shows you the extent to which these are false models, or they're models that are used as a kind of device to understand. But they're really, it's like when Aristotle talks about form and matter, right? There is no such thing as form without matter. And there's no such thing as matter without form. But nonetheless, he poses them as opposites because it's a way for him to think. It's a way for him to think about things. And the same thing with the sons, right? It's a way to think about things. So let's just look briefly. So the first, do you like the wise son? So what is his deal? So he's a smarty pants, right? I mean, there are many, many ways of reading this. It's a little bit like a Rembrandt painting. You can just see it from so many different perspectives. But one way of reading it is, he says, what does the wise son say? What are the testimony, statutes, and judgments that God has commanded you? And accordingly, you will say to him, you tell him that you tell him about the halachas of Pesach. He asks a very smart question. Now I'm being generous, and you give him a good answer, right? I think there's a non-generous way to read this, that he's the smarty pants, and the answer that you give him, he asks already these legalistic questions, right? He's the yeshiva bacher, right? Let's know the halacha. Let's do a pilpul, right? And the answer you give him is, don't forget, after you eat the afikomen, you can't have anything after that. Don't forget the taste, right? That the cognitively rich person is being told, don't forget what it tastes like, right? And that's, I think, a huge message for most people who make Seders. You get so involved in some demographics, they get so involved in what the halachot are that you lose the taste, right? It's hard. I mean, I do Seders. It ain't easy. It's like directing a play, right? Let's read the Rasha. Rasha Mu'amer, so ma'avodah hazot lachem, right? So that's, of course, what Chazal jump on, right? Where that's what all the commentaries use to jump on that, hazot lachem. And the text itself, lachem v'lo lo. He excludes himself. It's interesting, right? Because he separates himself from the klal, he is. What is kafar be'ikar? How would you translate that?
He betrayed the important part, or the principle.
Right. It's the heresy in what is most important. Which is interesting that inclusion is what's most important here. And you give him, it's hard to translate this, and you blunt his teeth. And okay. That's pretty harsh, isn't it? Harsh.
I was just about to say, I think, that sounds very harsh. It's not inclusive. Let's put it like that. If he was there, he wouldn't.
You know what? You might say, like, the most problematic son from a pedagogical perspective is this one. But I think there's a way to say that the most problematic child is not the Rasha, but it's the one who doesn't know how to ask. She'eni yodeh lishol. The Eni yodeh lishol is not the Tom, right? The Tom is somebody who's Tom. Right? We all know people like that. Tamim, right? Most people. Tamim, right? The She'eni yodeh lishol is not a Tom. He's very sophisticated, but he doesn't have the language to ask questions. He's not even part of the conversation. So, friend, that's a kind of response to what you were saying. The Rasha is still at the table, right? And he likes a good fight, right? And there's a chance maybe he'll get into it. But with all that said, with all that says, right? It does.
The answer doesn't really engage him, though. It kind of closes him off.
Another way of reading it is another way of reading it is like that, right? And that the pedagogy here is not even for him. The pedagogy is for the others, right? You're making an example of him. Right, but you can. It really, the text accommodates itself in many directions. But let's just focus avodah hazot. What is the zot here? What is he referring to? Make it real. Make the situation real. See this kid at the table. And he's smart, right? Because
why do I have to eat matzah all week? Why do I have to?
Yeah, but that's just like, not just that. I think it's not just like the experiential burden. But Alana, I'm hearing what you're saying, but why do I have to do it? Well, somebody else maybe answer, and then we can go back to Alana. I was saying that I think he's very intelligent. He's read the Bible. He knows the story. So perhaps why does he, like what Alana was saying, why do I have to do this now? Right? What is this makesher? Right? What do I need this for? And this being not just the 7 days, but this thing that we're doing now. Why do I need it? It was in the past. It's a great question. In a way, the whole Haggadah really turns on this question. And then the answer is Bavorza, which gets repeated one more time at least in the Haggadah. And you see it is a very exclusive answer, me and not him. Here is the pasuk in Chumash, and this is the mitzvah from this pasuk, v'higada levincha, you should tell to your son or child, b'yom ha'amar ba'avor zeh. So we asked before, what was the zot? Interesting. What is the zeh? Right. I mean, we can see it here in context. For the sake of this. Here they don't get the ba'avor zeh. What he did for me. Right, you lose that strength of the ba'avor zeh. So what is the antecedent of the zeh? So we can do what everybody does, every yeshiva boy does. We'll look at Rashi, right? The zeh is not, the fact that Rashi is talking means it's a question, right? If it wasn't a question, he's not talking. And his answer is weird. Ba'avor she'akayim mitzvotav kagon pesach matzah mor halalo. Ba'avor zeh. Okay. Now we started talking a little bit about temporal frames, and we might not get back to all of it, but can somebody explain this temporal frame here? Ba'avor zeh.
So this is more of a question, not the answer.
Yeah.
If I understand this correctly, he's saying that, God did all of this so that we could eat matzah, like Pesach matzah maror. Is that what he's alluding to? It's like
all of that in the past.
Yeah.
Was so we could
for
be
this
sitting.
Moment.
We can be sitting together right now at the table. That's why I said before. What happened? It's like the pasuk doesn't care what happened, right?
Yeah.
It all happened so we could be sitting here in front of us.
Yay.
And see how that's a good answer for the Russia, right? Because the Russia says he's thinking in cognitive terms. We know the story, right? It's a kind of enlightened perspective, right? We know about freedom, and our response is, yes, we know about freedom, but we can't live. We live freedom, and to live freedom, we have to tell a story of freedom. And I think that's true of all religious traditions. They tell different stories of freedom, if they continue, right? If they don't turn into mass political movements, right? Yes.
Yeah. I never realized how complicated this text is. I'm usually very hungry when everyone's.
That's a problem, right? Impatient. Impatient is the word, right?
Right. It seems to me to be, obviously, as where we've got to now, the text is a form of etiology.
What does etiology mean for those of us playing at home?
I suppose it explains what we're doing now by searching. So you invent a story going back to explain where we are in the present.
Okay. I would say, I mean, the emphasis, I think, is not inventing, it is on telling. And
retelling,
and there is invention in that retelling, but it's not pure invention. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Agreed. And in that retelling, they're telling you how to interpret the retelling simultaneously. But going back, I think from the start of the class, there's a paradigm shift in the etiology that took place with Moses, from slavery to freedom, from idol worship to texts. And like all revolutionary moments, it then has to go back to find authority somewhere previously. And so it goes back to the fathers. And then it has to answer the question, why are we retelling it at all? So it goes into the future to justify the retelling in terms of Mashiach.
Okay.
So to me, it's an incredibly long telescopic period of time, but the focal point is the actual Seder. You're actually sitting at that exact moment, trying to understand why is being Jewish about retelling and reinterpreting the same text.
Right. So and how does that relate to the question I asked you about the kids asking questions that they haven't seen yet? Meaning all the halacha is giving, where something's different, they ask stuff about they haven't seen yet.
It's almost like the rabbis have a theory of interpretation, that they know how people interpret and that they can predict, and they're trying to guide. I think it's very interesting that when you teach a child, you also remember your own childhood. So there's an interaction there which puts you back into the position of relearning how to reinterpret a retelling.
I would just say, I would say, on some level, I thought this was my Hamlet question, Ed. They're in on it. They know the story. Everybody already knows the story. And the children establish themselves from the beginning as they are not the She'eni Yodei Lishol. There they are asking. They're playing their part in the story. If you make a Seder for kids in this country, whether you teach them at home anything or not, they will come home knowing everything, right? The whole thing. So in a way, right, it says in the Haggadah, you should, towards the end, it says, Lefichach, where is that? You see, there's so much more we could do. We'll do one more thing after this. You remember the Lefichach? And therefore we should see ourselves as if we were leaving Egypt. As if, as Shakespeare's Touchstone says, much virtue in an if. Right, and Shakespeare's As You Like It is really, for those of us who've read it, is really his defense of poetry, right? That if, much virtue in an if, the if is the realm of the poetic, the realm of fiction, the realm of fantasy, the realm of dreams. And this is, we see ourselves as if. And I think that's part of the things that the kids are in on as well. It's ki'ilu. It really is ki'ilu. And that's part of it. That's part of the story and their performance. Part of it is scripted, as Ed is saying. I mean, but the spontaneity is that it's your kid, right? And I would also say, are there any young people here? No, I'd like to give advice to young people, right? Who are concerned about their kids not paying attention at the Seder. They don't pay attention. That's not their job. I actually have a granddaughter who will pay attention, but she's an aberration. And also it's easier. My grandkids do pay attention to me. My kids never paid attention to me, never, right? But it worked, right? And they're all coming for Seder, right? So something about it, right? So both the spontaneous and the scripted. So just one more thing. And this gets to the title that we really haven't addressed. This is the center part of the Haggadah, of Magid. There are 3 verses from Deuteronomy. And most of the Haggadah is an interpretation of these 3 verses. What is the portion of Deuteronomy that is read? It says, go and learn what Lavan the Aramean sought to do to Yaakov, our father, since Pharaoh only decreed on the males, but Lavan sought to uproot the whole people from the very beginning. As it is stated in Aramean, was destroying my father, and he went down to Egypt, and he resided there with a small number, and he became there a nation great, powerful, and numerous. Let's check out Deuteronomy 26:15. Okay, and let's go up a little bit. Oh, darn. Is it going to let me do Deuteronomy 6:15? Yes. Okay. So just to look at where this comes from. So I'll read it all, just the head start in English. When you enter the land your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess and settle it, you shall take fruits, or you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil which you harvest from the land. So in the future, when you come to the land, this is the people of Israel in the desert being told about their future. When you do that, you will put the fruit in your basket and go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name, Jerusalem. You shall go to the priest in charge of that time and say to him, so now you're given the script for the future. I acknowledge this day before the Lord your God, that I have entered the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to assign us. The priest takes the basket. You shall then recite as follows before the Lord your God. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a very great and populous nation. Most interpreters say the Aramean is Jacob or Abraham. The Haggadah pushes it and says it's Lavan because it wants to talk about people who wanted to destroy the Jewish people, right? But everybody knows that it's a forced reading, but it's there for a purpose. Now, what are the temporal? What's going on here? What is this command that's being given? Meaning we see this text and it becomes the means through which they provide lots and lots of interpretation. But why is the Haggadah based upon memory? I mean, that's the question. And the question is kind of the answer, right? The Haggadah is based upon memory. And you have this confession, this declaration, and the temporal frames are so, if you try to get them, they're very confusing because you're being told in the past about a place you have not been, about what you will do in the future when you settle that place to which you have not been. And you will bring first fruits to the Kohen, and you'll remember the people, the person who that scripted role will then remember the people who were commanded. Right. One more thing. Let's just see if Joshua is here. And there's one more passage, which is, here we go. Here's Rav's answer about when he says we start with idol worshipers. You do notice that even though we said that we started with Shmuel, we don't continue with him. It's strange that Rav gets priority in the storytelling. Shmuel gets told first, but then because Shmuel gets interrupted by, oh yeah, it's a mitzvah. You should say it at a certain time. You should say it at a certain place, or you should say it in a certain way. But the story that Rav tells takes priority here. And here is a verse also of memory. From the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers, and now the place Hamakom, have to think about what that name means in relationship to the Haggadah. God as place, God as spatial. Is the Haggadah being Spinozan here, right? God as a place. It's kind of very un-Jewish idea in a way. The place has brought us close to his worship, as it is stated. Joshua said to the whole people, so that the Lord God of Israel over the river did your ancestors dwell from always. Terach of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they worshipped other gods. And I took your father Abraham and from over the river and made him walk in all the land of Canaan and increased his seed, and I gave him Yitzchak, and I gave to Yitzchak Yaakov and Esav, and I gave to Esav Har Seir, a place to inherit it, done. And Yaakov and his sons went down to Egypt. So this story, and then we'll come back and conclude with the central text of the Haggadah. Here is another commemoration. Joshua remembering the past. And he's remembering the past also through God. So said the Lord God. Over the river did your ancestors dwell from always, me'olam. And they worshipped other gods. And this is the beginning of history. Me'olam is, if you read Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, it's like he gets this so well that there are just all of these nondescript idolatries surrounding Jacob and his family. And you feel so much in Mann, the Christian author, this sense of the chosenness of Israel. And just for those of you who don't know, Mann wrote Joseph and His Brothers, a 1,500-page novel about Joseph and his brothers between 1933 and 1943, when European Jewry was being, when they were trying to destroy it. It's incredible. It's incredible, incredible thing. But you feel that sense when I read, after reading Man, which I read recently, I feel this sense of individuation was what's happening here. There's the Me'olam, non-differentiated time. And then there's the chosenness of Abraham. But the chosenness of Abraham is also a chosen version of, I think, of time. Let's see. And I made him walk in all the land of Canaan. That's spatial. And I increased his seed, and I gave him Yitzchak. And I gave to Yitzchak Yaakov and Esav. And I gave to Esav Mount Seir to inherit it. So his story is over. And Yaakov and his sons went down to Egypt. And his story, Yaakov's son, just begins. Yaakov's story just begins in this going down, which goes back to what we were saying before about the two temporal narratives that are present here. I mean, it's true that Yaakov goes down and there is that redemption, but we do very much during the Seder experience that sense of going down, of not being in the middle. We're no longer, of not being at the end where we say and look back, oh, Baruch Hashem, right? We made it, right? It's a dangerous thing to say that. It's certain kind of Zionists will say that. We made it, Mashiach, let's bring the Korban Pesach. We made it, we're here. So there is that story of we made it. Harold Bloom said about Homer, that as great as he was, there was one thing he does not convey, which the Jewish tradition does convey, and that is of a promise fulfilled. A promise that gets fulfilled. We don't have that in the Odyssey. We know the story from beforehand. A covenant fulfilled. And the covenant fulfilled is very much part of Christianity, but also part of Judaism, that God fulfilled one promise. And that's what Pesach is really. And he fulfilled the promise to the patriarchs. That's why it goes back to Abraham. Because the people of Israel were not worthy of being redeemed, but the patriarchs were. So that promise was fulfilled, and we look back on that, but we still live in this story of being down in Egypt. And that's not, people ask on Yom Ha'atzmaut, well, what about, why are we, Tisha B'Av, right? Why are we mourning? And it's hard to understand on some level. And if you had told my grandparents that, my great-grandparents in Europe, that one day there would be a Jewish state and little Jewish children were being educated in Jewish schools, they would say Mashiach had come. That's what they would say. But it's not just spatial, it's also existential, right? The existential sense of suffering, of being in Egypt, right? And so the Haggadah really accommodates both of those perspectives. And the enactment in the present is an enactment. It's an enactment towards the future, right? Tradition, when properly practiced, is future oriented. It's pointing to, it's hopeful. I'm teaching you now because I believe you have a future. That's a very hopeful thing. And that vision of time, that's another thing that happens through the Jewish tradition, really, and we see expressed in the Haggadah. The idea of a time that we know the end, and it's also all over, as Ed knows from, and Danielle know from doing Shakespeare, that conception of time saturates the greatest English literature, Hamlet. Right? The idea of living in an open present, a present with possibilities towards a future, a present where it's worthwhile teaching your kids. And teaching your kids, and this is very hard, to be independent.
But isn't it also, this is Danielle, isn't it also about understanding the power of, I don't know whether to call it living history or living narrative, because if we ask the question, who tells stories? Who tells stories about the past? People who tell stories about the past are the people who, if you like, own that past because they were in some way victorious, or who recognize that that past has to do with their present and their future. And I think repeatedly in the Haggadah, we kind of have this sort of strange, we ask ourselves the question of where we are in relation to time. And the answer, it seems to me, is that we need to consider ourselves as the children who go through all of the phases of the four sons, but who ultimately are challenged by, as you said, by the fourth son, the one who doesn't know how to ask. And the power of the Haggadah and the retelling of that story year after year after year is to challenge us to understand the limits of our knowledge and the reasons why we tell stories, to perhaps reinforce emotions that we don't wholly understand and we can't wholly grasp and verbalize.
I think that aspect of challenge is really important. And I think you talk about different ways of telling stories. And I think there are two ways that are bad. One is nostalgic and the other is triumphalist, right? Because then it stops being lived, right? If you're nostalgic, you live in the past. You repeat the past. If you're triumphalist, you take some version of the past that is convenient to you or for you, and you turn that into a vision of the present, where storytelling is an activity. And the holiest, not the holiest, whatever, holiest. I'm just saying, the sacred in Judaism is an activity, and storytelling is the activity that is sacred on the Seder.
We had a very, very, I don't even know what word I would use to describe it, but my parents live very close to the Park Hotel in Netanya. And we were there. We weren't in the hotel, but we were there the year of the terrible terrorist attack. We saw, and we were redirected by the police. We went to my parents. We were reading the Haggadah, listening to the sirens and the screams. And I was asking myself, I feel as though I'm still, we are still coming out of Egypt. I felt that was such a central part of what we were experiencing. Something I'll never forget, and to become part of our family story that we talk about on Leila Seder.
The individuation of stories, of storytelling. Thank you very much for coming, people. I love having the chance to talk to all of you.
Thank you. It was great. Lots of things to think about.
Good. Enjoy.
Yeah.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you so much. Chag Sameach.